global warming. It is on the low end, and it is not, and this is very important, it is not an existential crisis. It would only be an existential crisis if we assumed that humanity is not going to adapt.
Is humanity becoming more or less dependent on natural resources? Well, we sat down with Marian Tupy, the co-author of 10 Global Trends That Every Smart Person Should Know, about the world's decreased dependency on natural resources. What follows is a clip on this topic from a longer conversation that we had with Marian. If you enjoyed this analysis, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Thomas Malthus, who was a famous writer, predicted back, I think it was in the 18th century, that the world would run out of food. Population growth, if it continued on its trajectory, would overwhelm the resources of the planet. He was later proved to be misplaced in his warnings. And that's why we talk about this idea of Malthusian trap. So let's look at population growth specifically, and also the resources that the global population uses. Many critics of market economies would say, well, we're inevitably going to deplete all of our natural resources and the population is going to overwhelm the world. What would you say in response to that?
Malthus was a good historian because he pointed out that throughout human history, when population grew, we would eventually run against that hard Malthusian trap whereby we couldn't produce more food on the acreage that was available, and then famines ensued. But Malthus was writing in 1792 or so, 1798. So right at the end of the 18th century, when the population of the world was 1 billion. Today, there is, I think it was 1 billion, but today there are 7.8 billion of us, and we are richer than ever, and we have more resources than ever. So whilst Malthus was a good historian, he was a bad prognosticator. So what happened, again, just as Malthus was writing, was that the Industrial Revolution happened. And we switched from being a species that is primarily dependent on agriculture to species that is primarily dependent on innovation. You can think about it in two ways for the economically inclined listeners. There are two types of economic growth. One is Smithian economic growth, and the other one is Schumpeterian economic growth. The Smithian economic growth is basically that you just add more people, land, and capital to economic production. And obviously there are only so many people, there is only so much land, there is only so much capital. So the returns on investment are tend to be restricted by how many people you have, how much acreage you have, and that sort of thing. So when Smith was talking about his spin factory and his division of labor, he was primarily referencing how can a small population of people become more productive by somebody just doing one part of the pin making process and the other one making the other part of the pin making process, so that you can maximize the amount of pins. Schumpeterian growth that we have experienced in the last 200 years, which is to say, again, after Smith dies, after he publishes The Wealth of Nations, Schumpeterian growth is dependent on innovation. So, instead of just developing a better and better type of plow, incrementally improving it over centuries, we've come up with tractors. Instead of using animal and human excrement in order to fertilize our crops, what we do now is that we create artificially synthetic fertilizer, synthetic nitrogen, which is much more powerful and much cheaper and much safer to handle. And consequently, we are able through innovation to produce much more food on the same acreage. Instead of killing whales in order to make candles from their fat, we are now using electricity. And instead of using coal for electricity, increasingly we are using gas and nuclear power and that sort of thing. So Schumpeterian growth can register much higher growth rates precisely because it is dependent on innovation. And innovation is a product of free minds and of people who are free to interact, to publish, to speak, and to profit from their innovations. And it took a very long time for Western political and economic institutions to become more free, to become more liberal, to become more open and more exclusive. But once that happened, and once people were free enough to start innovating, they did so. They did so with gusto. And today's growth and today's prosperity is really a result of that. Now,
Enjoying this analysis? Click here to sign up for our 30-day free trial for more content from the CIA.
the corollary point here is that even though there is 7.8 billion people around the world who are largely free to speak and to publish and to innovate, the prices of natural resources have actually fallen. Not only have they fallen in real terms, which is important, after inflation adjustments, 50 most important commodities are about 40% cheaper than what they were in 1980, but they have, more importantly, fell in relation to incomes. So once you look at the price of, say, a piece of lumber or a bag of oranges or a kilo of shrimp or beef or chicken, etc., and then you compare it to the increase in global wages, what you see is that they have fallen even more than just inflation adjustment. And the reason for that is, of course, that humanity is becoming more productive every year. So usually our incomes grow at a faster than inflation rate. And so I think that comparing prices of natural resources and of commodities to wages is actually more appropriate. And that's where we see that commodities are becoming more and more and more cheap. And price is an excellent indicator of whether natural resources are becoming more abundant or less abundant. And they're clearly becoming more abundant. If they didn't, price would go up.
So, Marian, what about global warming as a byproduct of economic activity and consumption? What is your view on this? Do you think that it is the existential threat that many climate change activists are warning that it is?
At this point in time, I'm convinced, more or less convinced, that human economic activity contributes to slight increases in global warming that we are currently experiencing. Those increases in global warming are at the low end of what the different environmental models predict. I accept that the world is lukewarming, as some people call it. We are certainly nowhere near the catastrophic scenarios that people have been predicting before, or the catastrophic scenarios that the IPCC has on its books. Now, it is important to remember that the IPCC produces a number of variants of the global warming models and puts different assumptions into those models. So the most catastrophic ones talk about 4 centigrade warming, but that would mean that, for example, the world stops using every other source of energy and just uses coal and things like that, which is obviously not happening, and it's not going to happen. So right now, we are living in the midst of global warming. It is on the low end, and it is not, and this is very important, it is not an existential crisis. It would only be an existential crisis if we assumed that humanity is not going to adapt and technologically innovate its ways out of problems. Now, given that for the last 200 years, we have innovated our way out of a lot of problems, including shortages of food and other things, I don't see any reason why we should expect no innovation and no adaptation moving forward. Let me give you 2 examples. One is Holland. The Netherlands are 1/3 of the Netherlands territory or so is under the water level. The Dutch have dried up Netherlands hundreds of years ago at a time when their technology was primitive and when they were extremely poor. By today's standards, they were extremely poor, and yet they have managed that. So I see absolutely no reason why the people of Bangladesh or other low-lying areas shouldn't be able to replicate what the Dutch did 100 years ago with more primitive technology and when they were extremely poor. I think that we know how to adapt to rising sea levels, which are rising, by the way, at a very slow pace. So the assumption that we are all going to drown due to increased sea levels assume that we are just going to stand here for the next few thousand years and not do anything. But that's not how human beings operate. When human beings are faced with a problem, they immediately start figuring out ways of fixing those problems. So I am unconvinced that this is an existential crisis. It is certainly not an existential crisis in a span of the next few decades. There is not going to be a day on which the world just blows up because there is climate change going on. After all, climate change has been going on for a very long time. But I do acknowledge that pumping out more CO2 into the atmosphere can have deleterious consequences. It can also have beneficial consequences. Some scientists estimate that the world food production and could actually benefit until as late as 2070s and 2080s. But regardless, I think that we should be moderately concerned about the increase of CO2 in the atmosphere. And for that reason, we need to innovate. We need to innovate our way away from fossil fuels. We don't need to do it immediately. We don't need to do it in a scope of 10 or 20 years. But it would be nice if, let's say, in 40 years' time, most of the world energy was provided by energy sources that do not spew CO2 into the atmosphere. Now, as it happens, humanity has had that technology for the last 70 or 80 years, and that's nuclear technology. Fission reactors provide plentiful energy, and they don't emit CO2 into the atmosphere. Unfortunately, the same people who complain most heavily about CO2 emissions are also the kinds of people who are opposed to nuclear fission reactors. So, that sort of irrationality, we need to overcome that. We need to start building safer, smaller, more modular, and cheaper fission reactors. And we should also put serious money into fusion reactors and figure out if we can produce fusion technology, which would be even safer. If the world can be powered in this way, then really CO2 stops being a problem, CO2 emissions stop being a problem, and we can focus on other things.
So Marian, what about the COVID-19 crisis? I'm thinking not only about the health effects, but also the policy responses from governments around the world. Do you think that those responses have been appropriate?
I'm not qualified to opine whether lockdowns and shutdowns were the right policy. I, however, do feel very strongly that the policy response needs to differ depending on the level of economic development in particular countries. It's one thing to shut down an economy in places like the United States and Britain, where one, sizable share of the population can continue to work from home because they're in the service industry. Two, these countries can borrow a lot of money at low interest rates, which they can then disperse among the population in order to reduce the human suffering. And it's a completely different thing when you are when you're shutting down a developing economy, a poor economy, especially one where you do not have an extensive or generous welfare net, where governments cannot really borrow a lot of money without risking run on the currency and economic difficulties. So if I were dealing with a country like Brazil, for example, and I dare say some countries in Africa, including South Africa, I would take into account the fact that a sizable part of the population depends on a daily amount of work in order to earn a daily amount of money. In other words, the difference between starvation and being only okay is whether you can perform that task that you were meant to perform on that day. So I would make the difference between developed and developing countries and how they reacted to that. With regard to COVID and human progress, look, I think that it sort of reminded us that instead of focusing on problems which are relatively minor right now and which will remain minor for many decades to come, such as global warming, those things should not have taken precedence over potentially serious problems such as COVID and the independent evolution of pathogens. Now, I don't want to say that, I didn't see this coming. Most people didn't see this coming. So, it's obviously very easy to speak with 2020 hindsight, but maybe this is a reminder that moving forward, we have to start being smarter about cost-benefit analysis and what is really a serious threat rather than what isn't. We have known for centuries, well, at least for decades, that pathogens are on their own evolutionary cycle, and that they break out with regularity. After all, this is not the first coronavirus that had broken out. There was the SARS outbreak and others, and that type of evolution that goes on at the micro level, at the microbial level, that's not going to stop. And so that is something that we should be focusing on rather than global warming, in my view.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this analysis, you might want to check out other videos in this series. My name is David Ansara. Please leave your thoughts in the comment section below and give this video a like. Until next time, take care.